Okay, so I wanted to continue with our discussion of Hilchos Tshuva, and we learned yesterday that the Rambam actually counts Tshuva as a mitzvah saseh. There's an obligation to do Tshuva, and it is derived from the vidoy, the obligation of confession, which the Torah writes specifically in the context of stealing from a ger who dies, not having any yorshim. You are mechuyev to confess your sin. And the Rambam generalizes that to be a chiyuv of tshuva in all averos. And even though that's only talking about vidoy, but vidoy by definition has to be sincere, and vidoy therefore presupposes charata la'avar, genuine regret for the past, and kabbalah la'asid, and resolution for the future. And therefore those are the three elements of the mitzvah of tshuva: charata, kabbalah, and concretized in the idea of vidoy. Again, remember that Yom Kippur has not been mentioned at all here. It has nothing to do with Yom Kippur. There is a mitzvah called Tshuva that applies the entire year. And then you'll remember that the Ramban has a simpler origin for the mitzvah of Tshuva, and that is the pasuk that says, V'shavta ad Hashem Elokecha. The Rambam understands that as a promise that before Mashiach, the Jewish people will do tshuva. It's not a mitzvah, it is a promise. But Ramban, Nachmanides, understands it to be a mitzvah aseh itself. In fact, in that connection, the Torah goes on and says, the Torah is not in heaven, the Torah is not on the other side of the sea. It is easy to do, ki karev elacha. So Ramban learns it is referring specifically to the mitzvah of tshuva. The mitzvah of tshuva is that which is actually easy to do. It reminds me a little bit when my son was in second grade. So he came home Erev Yom Kippur from school, or the day before Erev Yom Kippur, and we just asked him if he had any homework, because in the States, unlike Israel, they actually give homework in school. So he said, nah, easy assignment. The teacher just said, do tshuva. So I thought for him that would be easy. But the Maisa, the Ramban says, Ki karav elacha hadavar ma'od. Karav elacha, it's very accessible to you. The Ramban says that is going on the mitzvah of tshuva. Now the Rambam, we're still in Perek Aleph, the Rambam in Perek Aleph mentions, however, that not only is tshuva a standalone mitzvah, which it is, but it's also a necessary augmentation to other mitzvos, meaning to say, there are other mitzvos, when you do them, you have to do them with tshuva, or the mitzvah is not fulfilled. And the two examples are a korban. When a person brings a sin offering, a person brings a korban chatas for various averos. Again, let me just remind you, if you don't know, or if you don't know, when do you bring a korban chatas? What types of averos in the time of the Beis HaMikdash do you have to bring a korban chatas? So the Gemara lays down a very straightforward rule. Any avera for which if you did it b'mezid, if you transgressed it intentionally, you're either chayav misa, you're chayav the death penalty, or you're chayav kares, death in the hands of heaven. So when you do it b'shogeg, you have to bring a korban chatas. So an example would be Chilul Shabbos. Chilul Shabbos, b'mezid, if I was given warning, is technically a chayav misa, and even without warning, there's a chayav kares. So if I'm mechalel Shabbos b'mezid, I'm chayav misa or kares. So if I'm mechalel Shabbos b'shogeg, because I didn't know it was Shabbos or whatever, or I didn't know the halacha, I bring a korban chatas. By the way, that applies even today. You got to keep a record theoretically, although, I mean, I haven't done it, and I don't know anyone that does. But theoretically, actually not theoretically, practically, when the Beis HaMikdash is rebuilt, we will have a huge, it's like the IRS hitting you for $10 million of back taxes. I mean, we will have a chiyuv to bring a korban chatas for all of the Chilul Shabbos b'shogeg that we did. Right now, it's going to be almost impossible to reconstruct that, and it could be that all of the averos a person did before they became frum may not count because you didn't yet have that requisite language, but at least from the time a person became a shomer mitzvos, there will be a chiyuv of a korban chatas. Now, the Rambam makes the point, based on the Gemara, that a korban chatos does not give you atonement unless you do tshuva. Unless you do tshuva, right? So therefore, tshuva is not only a standalone mitzvah, but tshuva is necessary for the atonement of a korban. A korban will not give you kapara unless you do tshuva. Now, derech agav di agav, nothing to do with the Rambam per se, I want to share with you a beautiful, interesting ha'ora of Rabbeinu Yaina. Remember, Rabbeinu Yaina wrote the Sefer Shari Tshuva. There is something called a korban chatas, and there's something called an asham talui. Asham talui means a suspended guilt offering. When do you bring a korban chatas, and when do you bring an asham talui? So, Chazal explain that when I do an Aveira b'shogeg, and then I find out that I did the Aveira, meaning I now know I did the Aveira, I bring a korban chatas. So let's say, for example, I didn't know that Shabbos began at 6 p.m. I thought Shabbos began 6:30. So I did malacha at 6:15. I thought it was permissible. I then discover when I go to shul, and I miss Myra, whatever it is, that Shabbos was at 6. So I now know that what I thought was permissible was an Aveira. So that's called Chilul Shabbos B'Shogeg. Chilul Shabbos B'Shogeg, you got to bring a korban chatas. Now, Asham Tali is a more complicated scenario. What if I don't know? In other words, Shabbos began at 6, and I didn't know that, and I did malacha, but I'm not sure if I did malacha at 10 to 6 or 10 after 6. Meaning, I'm not sure. So here the rule is you bring what is called an asham taloi. Taloi means a suspended guilt offering, which gives you divine protection until you find out. Meaning, I bring an asham taloi, it gives me temporary protection. If I find out that I did malacha on Shabbos, later I bring a chatas even after the asham taloi. If I find out I didn't do an Aveira, so the asham taloi was a korban, but he didn't need an atonement. If I never find out, the asham taloi protects me. Okay, so an asham taloi is what you bring when you don't have the definitive knowledge you committed an Aveira, right? So that's the difference between a korban chatas and an asham taloi, right? All of that is very clear. Now, Rabbeinu Yaina points out the following halachic anomaly, which is a fascinating anomaly. When you bring a korban chatas, which is a sheep or a goat, is there a minimum value to the korban that you have to bring? And let's say, can you bring an emaciated goat that's worth only 2 zuzim, like chad gadja? The halacha is, yeah, there is no minimum value that a korban chatas has to have. You got to bring a sheep or a goat, but even if it's not worth very much, it's okay. When it comes to an asham taloi, there is a minimum value that the asham taloi has to have. It has to be 2 selas, which, whatever that means, that's a considerable amount of money. So Rabbeinu Yaina asks the obvious question. How is it possible that you got to pay more for an asham taloi than for a korban chatas? When you bring an asham taloi, the worst case scenario is you committed a sin for which you would bring a chatas. And maybe you didn't commit a sin at all. So you got to spend more money than when you know you committed a sin and you can bring the chatas for virtually zero? What logic would there be that an asham taloi would require a greater expenditure of money than a korban chatas? It's a good kasha. So Rabbeinu Yaina says the following idea. He says that when a person does an Aveira, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu imposes a penance, or a knas, or a fine, or a punishment on a person, to a large degree, the level of remorse that you feel can mitigate the chaimer of the einish, meaning the more charata I'm margish, the less onish I need. You see, because the bitterness of my heart, the regret, the remorse, gives me tremendous atonement. The less remorse I have, perhaps the onish has to be greater. So says Rabbeinu Yonah, in the case of a korban chatas, where a person knows they committed the sin, they know they committed the sin, they know. They didn't know at the time, it was a shogeg, but now they know they were mechalel Shabbos. Then naturally, there's a lot of remorse, there's a lot of bitterness. So Hashem says, your atonement can be very small, a korban chatas. But in the case of an asham taloi, the person doesn't feel such a remorse because the person will always tell himself, I probably did the malacha 10 to 6. I probably didn't sin at all. I really shouldn't let myself be bothered so much. But that's the trap. If you're not bothered by your aveira or by your possible aveira, the onesh will be greater. And therefore the onesh of an asham taloi is greater than the onesh of the chatas, precisely because the asham taloi, a person can rationalize and say, I have not done my aveira at all. Rabbeinu Yonah then applies the statement of Chazal that sometimes transgressing an Isser D'Rabbanan can be more chamor than transgressing an Isser D'Oraisa. Now, why should that be so? Obviously, rabbinic laws are not as severe as Torah laws. So why should transgressing a Rabbanan be considered worse than transgressing a D'Oraisa? So Rabbeinu Yonah gives exactly this reason, meaning, of course, a D'Oraisa Aveira is a bigger Aveira than a Rabbanan Aveira. For sure, that's the case. But that's the whole point. With a D'Oraisa Aveira, my charata is much greater. And because my charata is much greater, the punishment will be lessened by virtue of my charata. By a D'Rabbanan, I tell myself, it's only D'Rabbanan, not so important. But that's going to work against me, because that's going to mean the onesh will be greater because the charata is going to be less. Rabbeinu Yonah applies that same reasoning, as he said, by a korban chatas and by an asham taloi. By the way, don't confuse. There are korban ashams for other averas, like me'ila, different types of averas. We're not talking about that. This is an asham taloi. An asham taloi is a very specific korban for people who would be chayav a chatas if they knew that they did the avera, but when they don't know that they did the avera, they bring an asham taloi, like an insurance policy, to protect them until they find out. Yeah.
A question on the Gemara on Malchut, because on Malchut, because it brings a Breitowitz saying if you eat an ant b'shogig for any or for a kazayit amount, you get a chatat. A punishment, even though the basic it would be only malchut. Is it because we don't go like that, right?
That's certainly not the halacha. If you eat, for example, most tray food, let's say you ate basar b'chalov, you had a cheeseburger, or let's say you ate ham, right? Of course, it's an avera. If you did it b'mezid, you would get malchus. If you did it b'shogeg, if you ate ham thinking it was turkey or whatever it would be, shogeg, you do not bring a korban chatas, because you only bring a korban chatas for averas for which you're chayav kares or misa b'mezid, and ham or cheeseburgers, you are not chayav kares or misa. Now, if you ate chametz on Pesach, you would bring a korban chatas, because eating chametz is a chayav kares. If you eat chalev is the fat of a kosher animal, but certain parts of those fats are not kosher. They're removed by the butchers. You don't have to worry about it, as it were. But if you eat so this is my phone. It's over here. Chalev. If you ate chalev, you bring a korban chatas. But if you stamazah eat an ant, I don't mean your uncle's wife, for those from Chicago. I'm New England, so I say aunt. I say it the proper way, but I know the Midwest they say ant. If you eat an ant, you may be chayav 5 malchus, different lavin, but there is no korban for that. There is no korban unless it's a chayav kares.
Shalom. What are the equivalent of these offerings?
Yes, so what do we do today, right? So indeed, this is one of the reasons why, in the Siddur at least, we don't always say it, we should say it, we have korbanos. It says that when you're not able to bring the korban, then reading about the korban, learning about the korban, and really davening in general takes the place of the korbanos. So we do get the atonement of korbanos when there's no Beis HaMikdash through prayer, and specifically learning about the korbanos. You know, it's interesting that, everyone knows the Chafetz Chaim for his very practical books, right? The Chafetz Chaim wrote books that were Madrich Klal Yisrael in very practical areas, such as the classic Chafetz Chaim on the laws of Lashon Hara, which is a very practical issue that we struggle with. The Chafetz Chaim wrote the Mishnah Brura, which is a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch about Tefillah and Brachos and Shabbos and Pesach. Right, so the Chafetz Chaim was a person who was very, very concerned with giving Klal Yisrael practical guidance in halachic matters. But what is a little less known about the Chafetz Chaim is the Chafetz Chaim was a very big pioneer in bringing back the learning of the Masechtos dealing with korbanos, Zvachim, Menachos, Seder Kachim. Seder Kachim had been neglected for hundreds of years in Klal Yisrael. It wasn't Nogea L'Maisa, whatever it would be. And the Chafetz Chaim was the pioneer who brought back the learning of Kachim. So in the most advanced yeshivas like Brisk, Kachim is what they do, but that really comes from the Chafetz Chaim. And he did this in a lot of ways. Number one, at his own expense, he republished old Sfarim on Kachim that had been out of print for years. And he also wrote original works. You know, in the back of every Gemara, you'll see the Rif, right? So the Rif, what is the Rif? Revitziko Fasi. So the Rif is a kitzer. It's an abbreviation, a summary of the Shakla V'Tarya, so you can get the bottom line by going through it. So the Rif actually is a very good way to chazer in Masechta, to chazer the Rif. So for example, if there's 100 blot Masechta, there may be only 30 blot of Rif. It's a way of chazering. But the Rif only did his thing on the Masechtas that are Nogea L'Maisa. Gittin, Kedushin, Seder Moed. There is no Rif on Seder Kachim. There's no Rif on Zvachim, Menachos, because there's no Beis HaMikdash. It wasn't Nogea L'Maisa. So the Chafetz Chaim himself wrote the equivalent of a Rif on Seder Kachim, and he wrote commentaries on that as well. So the Chafetz Chaim was a pioneer, really, in bringing Kachim back to Klal Yisrael. And someone asked the Chafetz Chaim, why are you so into bringing Kachim back? It's not Nogea L'Maisa. As if the Chafetz Chaim didn't care about things being Nogea L'Maisa. And the Chafetz Chaim gave two answers. Answer number one is, if you believe in Mashiach, it is Nogea L'Maisa. What do you mean? The Beis HaMikdash might come tomorrow. What do you mean it's not Nogea L'Maisa? Don't you believe Mashiach can come any moment? That's answer number one. But answer number two is really connected to what I told you, and that is specifically because we don't have a Beis HaMikdash. The way we get the atonement of the korbanos is by learning about the korbanos. So to say we shouldn't learn about it because it's not practical obscures the fact that we specifically need the light of the korbanos in learning because we don't have it in action. Okay, so it's something to think about. Now again, I'm not advising you right now to take out Maseches Sevachim and start learning Maseches Sevachim. That might be a little daunting together with your other commitments in the center. But, you know, even if you take Parshas Vayikra and learn the Rashi, Chumash and Rashi and Parshas Vayikra, you will acquire quite a lot of knowledge about how the korbanos work. And I think that is something that people ought to do. I want to know about korbanos. Even the sections in davening. Okay, now again, the davening schedule is not built to really allow a full recitation of korbanos, which is a little unfortunate. But you can look at it as a learning project. For example, the parak Ezeu Makoman Shel Zvachim. It's actually a whole parak of Mishnah in Maseches Zvachim. It's the only parak of Mishnah, by the way, in which there's no machlokas. The only parak of Mishnah in all of Shas in which there is no machlokas. Every single statement there is according to everybody. Well, actually, that's not true. There is no machlokas stated in the Mishnah, but I have to correct myself. Some of the statements, there are Tanoim who argue with, but they're not in the Mishnah. That Mishnah does not state any particular machlokas. So, learn Isaiah Makoman. I mean, good. Even if you're not going to make it part of davening, you can learn it. Learn what it says. So that's how we get that koach today. Okay? So, but the Rambam makes the point, Tshuva is not mechaper without, a korban is not mechaper without Tshuva. Now, another example, and here I'm going to bring in Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is the great day of atonement, the day of forgiveness of sin. But unless you do tshuva, Yom Kippur alone doesn't give you atonement. Yom Kippur does not atone without tshuva. Now, what's interesting is, that's actually a machlokas, fascinatingly enough. Rav Yehuda Hanasi, Rebbe, actually says, Yom Kippur works even without tshuva. Wow. So like Rebbe, Yom Kippur is a much easier day. You could sleep in. You say, I'm going to sleep in, forget about tshuva. Yom Kippur will work for me, right? Yom Kippur works for me even if I don't do anything. That's Taka Rebbe. Yom Kippur, amazing thing. Yom Kippur is mechaper without tshuva. The only exception is not for violating the laws of Yom Kippur, meaning like this. If, God forbid, a person ate on Yom Kippur, so Yom Kippur will not atone for that sin unless he does tshuva. And that's a very logical point, because if he's rejecting Yom Kippur by violating the Yom Kippur laws, Yom Kippur is not going to work for him. So Rebbe is moda that for a violation of the laws of Yom Kippur, whether it's malacha or eating, you got to do tshuva for Yom Kippur to give you an atonement. But for everything else, Rav Yehuda Nasi says, Yom Kippur is mechaper without tshuva. Very amazing. Unfortunately, we don't paskin like Rebbe at all, and the Rambam and really everybody lays down the rule that Yom Kippur does not give you atonement unless you do tshuva. So both in the case of Korban and in the case of Yom Kippur, we see that in addition to tshuva being a standalone mitzvah, tshuva is a necessary condition for other mitzvos to become operative. The kapara of a korban does not get activated unless you do tshuva, and the kapara of Yom Kippur does not get activated unless you do tshuva. Again, Rebbe would argue with that, but we do not paskin like Rebbe. The Rambam also makes the point that even if you, let's say you steal, okay, let's say you committed some sin, bein adam b'chaveira. I stole. I damaged property. I damaged the person. I broke somebody's arm. Right? So it's very, very clear that the Torah requires restitution. Right? I have to give back what I stole. I have to pay the damages and the like. But the Rambam writes, there's actually three things you got to do in order to get atonement there. You have to make restitution. You must do tshuva to God. And you must seek the forgiveness, remember this is another halacha, of the person that you harmed. You must ask them to be mochel you. Now these are two different things. The tshuva is between you and God. You do vida, you confess your sin, you ask God for forgiveness. You got to do that. But tshuva and even restitution, and even Yom Kippur, by the way, tshuva, restitution, and Yom Kippur do not give you forgiveness until you seek the mechila of the person that you hurt. And then we'll see, the Rambam really discusses this in Perek Beis. If you sincerely ask mechila 3 times and the person refuses to give it, so at that point you are forgiven. At some point a person should not be hard-hearted. but you do have to make a sincere effort to ask mechila. Derech Agav, I just want to mention a very interesting nekuda. Rav Yisrael Salanter, the great founder of the Musar movement, etc., one of the great Gedolei Ador, died in the late 19th century, the late 1800s. And this was when the Chafetz Chaim was a young man. And the Chafetz Chaim's first sefer was the Sefer Chafetz Chaim on the laws of Lashon Hara. It was anonymous. It was anonymous because Chafetz Chaim is based on the pasuk in Tehillim. Mi ya'ish Chafetz Chaim, who is the person who desires life? Nitzor l'shoncha meira, guard your tongue from evil. So he was called Ba Chafetz Chaim. And for a number of years, the sefer was anonymous, but eventually his identity was revealed. So it is said, Rav Yisrael Salanter read through the Sefer Chafetz Chaim, and he said, Baruch Hashem, Hashem has given Am Yisrael leadership, spiritual leadership, for the next generation. But it is recorded that there's one halacha in the Sefer Chafetz Chaim that Rav Yisrael Salanter was cholek on. He disagreed with the Chafetz Chaim on one halacha. What halacha is that? Whether you should ask mechila for Lashon Hara. Let's imagine I said Lashon Hara about you. I said, this guy is like the biggest idiot I ever met. Can't believe he's able to walk around, or chew gum and walk, or whatever it would be. Okay? So I really said very improper words about the person. Now, the Chafetz Chaim writes, that's like any other Bein Adam L'Chavero. If I would slap you, if I would break your property, I have to go to you and ask forgiveness. So the Chafetz Chaim says, I am mechuyav to go to you and ask your mechila. Now, Rav Yisrael Salanter didn't agree with that. Because he said, well, wait a second here. When I ask your mechila, you're entitled to then ask me for what? Right? You don't have to be mochel until you know what it is. So I ask, please forgive me for what I said about you. So you're going to say, well, what did you say about me? Well, you don't really want to know. So what's going to happen? So I'm going to then tell you, oh, you're the biggest idiot that God ever created in the world. The Rav Yisrael Salanter's point is this. Asking mechila should not be an excuse for causing more pain. Right? I mean, I myself got a call. Somebody says, I don't know what's wrong. He says, I really got to talk to you because of what I said about you. And I said, well, listen, I'm mochel you. Please, you don't have to come and tell me what you said about me. He says, no, I have to. I mean, it's really a classic example of what Yisrael Salanter was concerned about. So I'm thinking for 3 weeks already. What did he say? So Rabbi Yisrael Salanter says, as a matter of common sense, that when asking mechila is going to cause more pain to the person than not asking, you are patur from asking mechila. You do tshuva and ask God to forgive you and ask God to even put into that person's heart to forgive anything you did. So this is a big machlokas. The Chafetz Chaim was very literal. The Chafetz Chaim says, God asked mechila, say what it is you did, and then hopefully the guy will forgive you. Rav Yisrael Salanter said not to do that. Now, interesting question. So you have a machlokas, Rav Yisrael Salanter and the Chafetz Chaim, and this is something that's a very nogei l'maisa, because unfortunately we're nichshal in Lashon Hara. Right? I mean, this can happen a lot. Do I have to go and tell you what I said about you? Whatever it would be. So who do you paskin like? So obviously I'm not able to give you a psak, but they say in the name of Aaron Kotler that as great as the Chafetz Chaim was, in inyanim of Musar and Midos, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter is considered to be the final authority. So Rav Aaron Kotler would tell his Talmidim that they should not ask mechila under circumstances where asking mechila is going to cause pain and suffering that could otherwise be averted. Now, obviously, that would depend. If the Lashon Hara I said about somebody is already public, in other words, it's known that I said this about you, and you know that already, then eino chinami. Avada, you'd have to follow the Chafetz Chaim's psak and you'd have to ask mechila. That's not the machlokas. But the machlokas is when it's an unknown thing that, you never heard of it, you wouldn't know about it, then Rabbi Sosalanter says it's sometimes better not to say it. So that's something you think about. Yeah.
On the previous topic, when the Rav mentioned property damage,
Yeah.
that when a person does that and they could owe monetary payment, the Rav said that there's three things the person needs to do. They need to pay restitution, do
Yeah.
Yeshivat to Hashem, and
Ask forgiveness.
So in the case of restitution, if the person that you damaged forgives you on that, is that valid, or is that they're almost blocking your kapara?
Oh, no. So that's an interesting point. That is a very good point. Any monetary obligation can be waived by mechila. So it's possible. So for example, if you damage my property,
Right.
and not only am I mochel you in terms of forgiving the sin, but I even say forget about paying me, I am not blocking your kapara, because monetary obligations can be erased by forgiveness. You can always be mochel a debt. That's not a problem. So that's an interesting point of mechila having a double meaning. It's interesting. There is mechila on the sin, but you still owe me the money. But then there can also be mechila on the money. Right? We're using the same word, but it's referring to two different processes. In fact, just to be sure we don't lose that, before Yom Kippur, it's so fascinating how the solemn moments before Yom Kippur, we're still very practical. There is a tefillah in the Machzor that many people recite before Kol Nidre, Yom Kippur night, or right before Yom Kippur. This is called Tfilas Zaka, the prayer of purity. Maybe you remember it, or you say it. You have to get the show a little early because it's a long prayer. It's called Tfilas Zaka. It's in every Machzor. And Tfilas Zaka at the end says, I hereby forgive, I hereby am mochel anyone that has hurt me, and just as I am mochel them, I pray that they should be mochel me. Okay, and that's an important thing. In fact, the Mishnah Berurah writes, even if you're not going to say all of Tfilas Zaka, you should say that paragraph. That's at the very end of Tfilas Zaka. So the way it's worded is so practical. It says, I hereby am mochel anyone that hurt me, but I am not mochel any money that they owe me, because otherwise, you see, in other words, I'm mochel the sin, but I'm not mochel the money. If I wouldn't put that in, when I say I'm mochel, that means they don't have to pay me anymore. So Jews are very practical people. So even when I'm at the highest level, I'm mochel all the sins. But if you owe me the money, I still expect it to be paid, and the like. So we're very practical even in the middle of the mechila. But it is a very good point. The word you see this, the word mechila is used in two different senses in that way. Okay. Alrighty. Okay, so that is the mitzvah of tshuva, how it augments Yom Kippur, how it augments korbanos, how it's necessary in Bein Adam L'Chaveiro. By the way, what's the source that Yom Kippur or tshuva does not give you a kapara unless you seek the forgiveness of the person that you hurt? Because it says by Yom Kippur, Ki bayom hazeh yechaper aleichem, on this day God will give you atonement, l'tayir eschem, to purify you, mikol chatayseichem, from all of your sins, lifnei Hashem titaru, in front of God you shall be purified. But the Mishnah reads lifnei Hashem as going backwards rather than forwards, meaning mikol chatoseichem lifnei Hashem. Yom Kippur will give you atonement for the sins you committed to God. But the sins you committed to other people, you have to get their forgiveness. Now, there is an interesting machlokas about this. We know that in the halachic system, one of the ways we divide mitzvos is we divide mitzvos between bein adam lamakom, between man and God, and bein adam l'chaveiro, those that involve interpersonal obligations between man and another person. Now, the truth of the matter is, every bein adam l'chaveiro is also a bein adam lamakom. So, when I steal, I'm committing a sin against you, but I'm also committing a sin against God, because God said don't steal. So, Bein Adam Lamakom is only Bein Adam Lamakom. Bein Adam Lechavero is both Bein Adam Lamakom and Bein Adam Lechavero. So here is the interesting shaila. When we say that Yom Kippur and Tshuva do not atone for the mitzvot Bein Adam Lechavero unless you ask the person's forgiveness, does that mean that none of the sin is atoned? Or no, the Bein Adam Lamakom aspect is indeed covered by Tshuva and Yom Kippur, but you're still left with the Bein Adam Lechavero, meaning is it none of the sin is atoned? Or the man to God aspect of the sin is erased, but you're left with Bein Adam Lechavero. So that's a big machlokas. The Rambam is not clear. I don't think you could draw any particular proof from the Rambam. The Rambam just brings the Mishnah that Bein Adam Lechavero, there is no atonement until you ask mechila, you ask forgiveness, but whether that means there's zero atonement or whether it means you're covered by the Bein Adam Lamakom and it's only Bein Adam Lechavero that's not covered, right? So that's, as I say, that's a big machlokas. Okay, so Mr. Hashem, we'll continue next week. And again, as I say, I haven't figured out how I'm going to allocate it, but I am planning to also do Nach as well. So one day Nach, one day Hilchos Tshuva. I hope it will not be too confusing. Okay, have a good Shabbos, good week.
Thank you for listening to this Ohr Somayach production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.